Welcome to Journeys with the No Schedule Man, exploring authentic stories of personal growth and lessons learned from people living true to themselves with creativity, passion, and purpose. For all past episodes, subscribe on iTunes or visit noscheduleman.com. And please connect, share, and contribute with a comment, rating, or review. And now, here's your host, the No Schedule Man, Kevin Bulmer.
I've been known to struggle with reality. It's not that it is any real mystery.
The question this week is, what are you competing for? And with whom are you competing? Welcome. I'm Kevin Bulmer. This is Journeys with the No Schedule Man, helping to create positive change by exploring and sharing authentic conversations on personal and professional growth. And this week we're joined by Jake Thompson, the founder and Chief Encouragement Officer at Compete Every Day, which is a global lifestyle brand committed to reminding you that your life is worth fighting for. Compete Every Day strives to reignite the competitive fire already within you that's necessary to achieve life's victories. It's a great story. It happened first was a passion project and has become a worldwide motivational brand. Originally, Jake started Compete Every Day to connect competitors, provide quality apparel, meaning shirts and stuff like that, and to motivate people to live a powerful life. Like everybody else that's joined me on this podcast, Jake's story is unique. It's not linear, and all of the lessons that he learned along the way have gone into make him what he is today. He talked a lot about competing against yourself. And I'll admit, and I didn't say this to Jake, when I first heard about his brand, Compete Every Day, I sort of had not a negative reaction, but I wanted to know more about it because I have always been very competitive, but to a point that's been detrimental to me. I was coming at that with a combative, aggressive energy. And as soon as I read in The Science of Getting Rich by Wallace D. Wattles that you're to create rather to compete. So to create rather than to compete what has already been, or compete for what has already been created, I've changed my personal model from a thought of competition to a thought of creativity. But we're getting held up in vocabulary here, or rather I am. And as soon as Jake put it into the context of competing against yourself, to do better than the you that you were yesterday, to strive to make tomorrow a little bit better than today, to learn something new about yourself, to stretch yourself, to achieve and to try something new. I immediately understood where he was coming from and am all 100% on board with the brand of Compete Every Day. Not that I wasn't to begin with, but I'm just being transparent about how I first reacted to it. It's always great to hear the story behind the story. Also really related to the part, well, a lot of Jake's story, but just a few things that jumped out at me and stood out to me immediately after our conversation and during it, for that matter. We talked about how hard it was to build a business. I've been going through that as well, and I don't find a lot of people talk about that, or at least those that I've come across when you go and you look at what they have to teach or their courses that they put up online or whatever their models are for success or fulfillment or any of that kind of stuff. We still seem to gravitate toward success in 3, 5, 10 easy steps, whatever you think it is. We want a blueprint, we want a map, we want a system. But here's the thing, we're all unique and it doesn't work that way. You've got to go through the journey, which is why you've got to compete against yourself, to stretch yourself and be willing to do the work. Now, maybe you can catch lightning in a bottle and you'll feel like you've had success overnight. And if that's the case, good for you. But for those of us who are looking to really authentically get in tune with what matters most to us, and to align our work and our life's mission accordingly, unfailingly, what I'm finding and hearing from everybody else like Jake who joins me on this podcast is, it is a process. It takes time. It takes patience, and it takes hard work. Here are 3 of the key takeaways that immediately stood out to me from my time with Jake. Number 1, I'd never heard anybody say this before. He talked about building a giant sandcastle with his life. This came up when he was talking about getting away from or deciding to move out of the line of work that he had envisioned himself getting into for the first part of his life, but then kind of coming to terms with what he was doing and what his legacy was going to be, and he related that to building a giant sandcastle, something that was just going to wash away with the tide and wasn't really going to last I thought that was a terrific analogy and wanted to point that out here. Number 2, he used the phrase, I was ignorant enough to be dangerous. And at a separate time, he talked about the willingness to step into conflict. So the ignorant enough to be dangerous, I would say that the way I'd phrase it would be not letting what you don't know slow you down or stop you. Sometimes not knowing is your best weapon because you don't have that story, that script, those ideas of why you shouldn't or can't move forward into something. Sometimes your ignorance can serve you because you don't stop yourself before you ever try, like some other people may because they've tried and failed. And when you're willing to try, you're dangerous in a good way. And that brings me into the second part of what I just said, the willingness to step into conflict. To be right on the edge of being uncomfortable, or right on the edge of discomfort might be a better way to put it, and then acting anyway. You can get incredible results if you're willing to step into those two things. Number 3, the power of story and storytelling. So yes, Compete every day is a brand and it's a product, but it's much more than that. It's a story. And I wish I could get the people that I work with in business to understand that everything is linked to story, and your best chance to stand out and connect with your customers, members, volunteers, donors, sponsors, whatever it might be, is to tell your story in your authentic voice. But instead, we advertise, we market, and we sound like ads, and we become cartoon characters of ourselves. Well, eventually, you'll come around to realizing that if you want to differentiate yourself, you are going to be yourself. Because no two of us are completely alike. No two stories are completely alike. And Jake has understood that. And so he talked about Compete every day being a story and being about storytelling. He said that his life was missing a great story element. This refers back to the part about the sandcastle I mentioned a while ago. And he wanted to build a great story, a hero's journey, to have something that he could live his life that way and build it as he went. And that story can be told for generations and hopefully affect people in a positive way through the work that he's doing. And they can be part of that story too. He also talked about how he's built Compete every day into such a strong story brand with a podcast, with his speaking, with the community he's built. That is a powerful lesson. If you are in business in any way, shape, or form, please pay attention to what Jake shares about the power of story in building a brand and a business. That's the way you set yourself apart. You're going to absolutely love this. Here is Jake Thompson, founder of Compete Every Day, on Journeys with the No Schedule Man. Jake, I'm curious what comes to mind, if anything does at all, when you reach back in your memory and try to recall one of the first times where you had to say to yourself, Jake, come on, man, like, are we competing the way that we know we're capable of here? Maybe we need to step it up a little bit more. What comes to mind?
It's funny that probably the story that I go back to the most was in 2013. I'd over leveraged us a little bit. It was my second year in business. I'd started in 2011, so I was still kind of in my second year, and had invested into a handful of events that just did not go well. We shouldn't have spent at the level we did. We thought we would do well at these type of events, did not. And I remember driving out of Los Angeles one night after doing kind of a 4-day event, and my team had flown back. I was driving back with all the equipment and the apparel, and really just in that solemn place that I think a lot of people get to during the course of their journey of, is this for me? Do I have what it takes? Am I really cut out for this? Maybe I should look at something else. Driven from outside of LA, there's not a whole lot if you're going east. It's pretty desert and desolate. And so on a Sunday night, I'm seeing headlights coming to me, but my direction, there's not much on the road. And I'm really just wrestling the whole time of this business and this message and everything hadn't come together as quickly or the way I thought it would. And I, mentally wrestling with myself, a conversation started popping into my head. And it was one I'd had about a year and a half earlier. So just fresh into the business with a good friend of mine. who over the course of lunch had asked how's this new venture you started? How's it going? And he said, I know you're probably frustrated it hasn't taken off as much as you wanted, but here's the fun thing. He said, you are your own worst accountability. And I kind of looked at him. He said, well, think about it. You have this message on competing every day, regardless of what happens, regardless of the obstacles and anything that you're up against. You've built this message, and ultimately you've started building a community of people who believe that same message and buy into this idea of competing every day for your life. So you can change the business, you can modify it, you can do a number of different things, but giving up and quitting is never one of them. Because at that point, you'll have told everyone that bought into this message that it's ultimately just a lie. And as that conversation's running through my head multiple times as I'm driving through the desert, it really becomes that, am I actually competing? Like, if I'm so busy competing for my goals, I don't have time to be stressed about him and how it further impacted the direction and trajectory I started going on, because I really had to force myself to have the conversation that I can invest my time and energy into complaining about the situation and worrying if this is right for me and am I the right person and woe is me and all of this, or I can take all of that creative energy and that time and that effort and put it into something productive and useful that can advance the message forward or impact the community.
Tell me more about what competing means to you.
For me, it's a matter of taking action to be better than you were the day before. For a lot of people, they hear the word competition and they immediately go to sports. So they immediately go to this idea of me versus you. And in all reality, I know that the world teaches us that that's what competition should be because of sports, but we don't control our opponents. I shouldn't be worried about competing against you because I don't control you. I don't control who you know, what you do, your effort, your energy, the talent you're born with, how far ahead of me you are, how far behind me. Any of that I don't control. But I do control myself. I 100% control my effort, my discipline of getting up in the morning, my writing down my notes from every day to learn of where I misstepped and what victories I had as well, and how can I apply them the next day. And so for me, competition is really this idea, and competing every day is this idea of competing against who you were in an effort to, one, become a better individual, but two, impact those relationships you have and achieve those goals that you've set for your life, whether it's a personal ones or professional or both.
So when you, and forgive me if you already covered a little bit of this, you dropped out for just a second when you were answering the previous question, Jake, but I'm curious then, given that criteria, how you came away from that situation in 2013, that lonely drive, that asking yourself, am I really competing? What were some of the next steps that you took after that to kind of get yourself back into your groove?
For me, it was a matter of stepping back and not worrying about how much I'm trying to drive through the door sales-wise, but more shifting my focus to how many people can I impact and what are the ways I can impact them. So that became the main priority. And then secondarily, how can I look at what I've done from a business level and do it differently so I don't put us in this position in the future? And for me, it became a matter of grinding, which is essentially a lot of people, you talk about competing every day. It's this matter of grinding, where I spent from August till January of 2014, August of 2013 to January of 2014, traveling about every weekend, working trade shows, marathons, fitness competitions, events. I was hitting the market. I was getting out on the ground, boots on the ground, talking to people. Days I didn't want to do it, I still got up and did it. And every time I would go do these events, that would help the secondary piece. But the main focus was having conversations with individuals at these events to find out what they're competing for. And as you have these conversations, and as I was talking to more and more people, I got to see the diversity and what drove people to act. Some people that, it was purely aesthetics. They wanted to compete and they saw it as a physical sense, and it had to do with their sport. Whereas other individuals, it was a matter of, it was a way for them to step out of their comfort zone. They ran a marathon to show their kids what's possible, because for them, their ultimate goal and what they compete for is to be the best example and parent they can be for their children. And so that shift of turning my perspective of just trying to build the business to how can I impact people really helped the drive, because at that point it gave me extra fuel and energy pushing forward through those long days, through that grind, through the shift in the business direction, where I never grew tired of focusing on them. You get worn out and you get a little weary, but I wasn't tired of doing that work because I was able to have those conversations and get to know people and impact them.
What did you learn about your business then through the process of, I'm trying to figure out how to how to ask this. I find it interesting that you went the opposite of trying to play the drive more sales card. It was the make more impact, so that in a way that I can better understand my business, which it sounds like you did from all of that personal one-to-one interaction. What then did you learn about the business by going through that?
You know, I learned two things, really. I learned, one, that not everyone is motivated to be better. Not everyone is growth mindset, success-driven oriented. And that's okay for those individuals, because there's not quite been the motivation or the spark or the message that's ignited that within them, that's given them, kind of as Tony Robbins puts out, that pleasure or that pain to invoke change within their lives. And on the other hand, it was the diversity of the message. When I would ask people what they would compete every day for, and I would hear the things that they would say, they were all very different. They were alike in the fact that they were driven and wanted to compete to be better and achieve this or compete for this person, but their reasons and their motivations were very different, which from a business sense gave me great hope, because if all these people were seeing the same message and taking away different pieces of it that fit their life, it meant that we had a great audience and reach that we could grow it and really impact that for us. And I mean, yeah, you see a lot, and I'm focused now, 7 years in on sales and how do we grow. But at the end of the day, I'm focused on the impact, because in my opinion, the impact you make, the relationships you build, the messages and motivation we can give someone, if it can create just a little bit of a spark, if it can do something to pivot their path just a little bit in a better direction, then we create a bond with them that the brand and the message and the individual become linked. And the apparel and the business side just become complementary to that, because we're on a different level talking about motivations and competing and mindsets and everything like that ties it all together really well. And it just happens, some of it happens to go on a t-shirt.
Let's go back in time a little bit, Jake, to talk about how the opportunity for this impact even began. Where did the seeds of Compete Every Day start to formulate for you?
There were bits and pieces back in 2010. So kind of the short synopsis is I'd grown up wanting to be a sports agent. I wanted to be the next Jerry Maguire, represent guys in the NFL. Spent college and then 2 years after college interning with an agency, and decided that really wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. And so fall of 2008 hits, the economy is in the tank. I get into a position where I can't get a job. I had an MBA. I was overqualified for entry-level jobs and couldn't even get looked at. But yet I had non-traditional work experience, and so I couldn't get a managerial or higher-level associate type position. So I started freelancing. I would do graphic design, marketing strategy, community management strategy, content planning. And I began to work with a number of different groups from a variety of industries, and built up a pretty successful consulting business that I was on the outside very happy with. Money was going into my account all the time. I was single. I very much enjoyed it. But over time, I felt an emptiness there in terms of I was doing this all for completely selfish gain. And I read a book called A Million Miles in 1,000 Years by a guy named Donald Miller. And in the book, he talks about our lives and how great stories and the characteristics that make the great stories and movies and TV shows and books that we read also can make for a great life. And some of the biggest pieces of that are the willingness to step into conflict, the desire to have a goal much bigger than just selfish pursuits, and wanting to invite others to be a part of it. And I remember reading that book and being such a fan of movies and stories and books that my life was missing this great story element. I didn't have a mission or a goal that was bigger than driving my own bank account. I wasn't doing anything that I was inviting anyone in. I wasn't trying to build an agency or a team. It was just kind of a solopreneur setup for me at the time. And I really struggled with this idea that I was building a giant sandcastle. And we all know the story and the things that happen to sandcastles when the water comes in. It washes it all away, and there's nothing left. And for me, that's how I started to see where the direction my life was going. And so I started to explore this idea of pursuing greatness in your life. Could I encourage people with betterment in pursuing greatness in areas of their life, such as their health, their faith, their relationships, their goals, their careers? And over the course of exploring that over 3-4 months and playing with this messaging, this idea of competing every day came out. And it was drawing back on my youth and growing up playing sports all the time, being a younger, smaller athlete, to where I had to really outwork and outsmart a lot of my opponents in order to play. And so I'd always had this drive to compete, but this time around it was, how do I compete against myself? And so at that point I had the brand name and the message, and that was the end of 2010. And I had zero idea of what I wanted to do with it. I started playing with a few different routes and opportunities that would pop up and try to force this compete message into it. And nothing would really ever stick or resonate except just the message. And so the channel wouldn't, the product wouldn't. And so eventually my best friend, we were roommates at the time, recommended I look at this company called Life is Good. They're based out of Boston. If you're familiar with them, they're two brothers, Bert Jacobs, and I'm going to blank on his brother's name. But they founded this company called Life is Good, t-shirt company, with a stick figure guy, ironically named Jake, and all around the power of optimism. And my buddy said, hey, these guys sold these t-shirts out of a van, and they're a multi-million dollar company now. I think your message has that ability to resonate in a same way to a different audience. And I think you should really look at apparel. And so for me, I didn't know any better at the time. I was kind of ignorant enough to be dangerous that I decided to put some money we had set aside for a guy's vacation into a couple of boxes of t-shirts and tanks, and just started selling them out of the back of my car to anyone and everyone that I could, and compete every day, grew from there.
I'm curious about how to haul us backwards for a moment before we explore compete every day a little bit more. How was it that you knew that the sports agency business was not the story that you wanted to pursue?
I think a little bit had to do with the situation I got into. At the time, my sophomore year of college, I start writing every agency I can find in the U.S. I'm writing, anyone and everyone I can. I just want an opportunity. I want to intern. I want this. I want this. And I had two guys write me back. And one guy, he represented a friend of mine from high school. They offered me an opportunity to do an internship. It was in the Midwest, in a downtown city that I would not be able to afford an unpaid internship to live downtown there and work for the summer. The other guy was based in Texas and was with a good agency, a good mid-sized agency, seemed to have a great team. He worked for directly under the main owner. And over the course of the 2 years, the more I got to know with the specific individual, not the owner and I are actually still really good friends, but the more I got to see a certain individual, the more I kind of questioned what gray areas they would play in and whether I wanted to be associated with that. And if that was what was required to excel in this space, that wasn't really what I wanted to do. And I would see it more and more. And for me, the kicker was the last year there was a kid I'd been recruiting. I'd found him in the summer, gotten to know him, gotten to know his family, had gotten a great relationship with him, and was down to the final two individuals to recruit him and hopefully sign him. And at our final meeting, he pulled me aside afterward and said, hey, listen, if I could sign with you, I would sign with you and we'd go. He said, but I don't trust the guy you work for. And he said, so that since he would have to handle the contract, because I hadn't gotten my NFLPA certification yet, he said, I'm going to go with these other guys. And I mean, that crushed me, because one, it validated a lot of things I had been wrestling with about the situation I was in, but it was the opportunity and the thing I'd worked so hard for, I lost because of something outside of my control. And started to see that this was my way in, was through this route and this individual. And that was not where I wanted to go or be associated with coming up. And so at that time, that's when I decided to step away. It was 2 weeks left in grad school. I'd gone specifically to grad school to get my MBA so I could get certified by the NFLPA, and ultimately ended up just walking away from it.
How did you feel at that time?
Part of it, I was okay walking away, because I knew that if I stayed, I was going to completely lose my love for the game. It's like you don't ever want to see how a hot dog is made. And sometimes you don't want to see behind the scenes and how certain things really go on. Part of it was crushing from the fact that this is what I thought I was going to do all my life. I absolutely thought I was going to go this route and be the next Jerry Maguire, and that's where I wanted to go. And then part of it was a little bit freeing in the fact that I didn't have a clue what I was going to do at this point or what my next steps were. And so it was kind of having the blank whiteboard right in front of you to draw whatever you wanted.
I'm curious about how a disappointment like that, of something happening beyond your control, taking away so much of what you worked for and confirming some of the suspicions, that's maybe not the word I want, but some of the ill feelings that you had toward that, how that might have carried forward, if at all, to where now you find yourself in a position where you're building a business, and you've already referred to your team at times. I'm wondering how challenging it is to delegate and to trust other people with what you've built really out of nothing.
It's tough. I think for any entrepreneur, it's really hard to leave the baby with the babysitter. Is kind of a fun way to put it. I was more than forced into a situation a couple of years ago where I went on my honeymoon, and I was in Thailand for about a week and a half. And so my team had to run complete point on the company because my hours were off and everything else. And they handled it great. My kind of number two that I work with is, incredible. And I spent so much time with her and with other members of the team, pouring into them the vision and the passion and why I'm doing what I'm doing, why this is important. And anytime we would get emails from customers about impact or the encouragement they'd been given by something they saw online or an apparel piece they bought, I shared that to show that the impact that they made, even if they didn't feel it with the customer, was there, and why we're doing what we do and why it's important that we do what we do. I'm very cognizant of how I try to lead our team, how I communicate, because I've been in situations with poor leadership and poor management. And I've seen, what that does to a brand and a community, but I've seen what it does to a team, and people mentally check out. And there's nothing more damaging to a company than employees who do not care, because if they don't care about the company and the brand, then they're not going to really care about the employees. And then it just ultimately falls apart. Whereas you get companies that people just, care. Just caring about your employees, caring about the impact you can make on them. Customers feel that and they feed off of that. And your team members do as well, because they see themselves as part of that bigger story that I talked about with Donald Miller's book.
How did you get to the point of trying to think again about how I want to ask this, about as you had started Compete Every Day, what did it look like when you looked around and decided, okay, I need to go and get some help here? How did that look?
Yeah, it was, really I looked at a couple different pieces. I'd worked with a couple of consultants here and there just to kind of help me refine a few things and get an outside perspective. And then honestly, it was a friend that I was looking for help working events. At that time, I was working pretty much all of our trade shows and events. And I was really at a point where I was spending more time packing up working shows than I was able to build the business side of it. And so a friend of mine's sister was moving to town. He was like, hey, listen, she's looking for some part-time work. Do you have anything? I said, absolutely. Got her involved. The funny piece is she started and has a small yoga apparel brand. And when you think about competition in yoga, you think they're on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And Christina has done a really fun job of how she's adopted and grown into that compete message and how it's kind of impacted her a little bit. And the fact that when she came into the company, it was more of a part-time job. She wanted to work events. She wanted to learn some of the apparel space that she could apply to her business. And that was kind of the extent of it. But the more we got involved with building it and talking to customers and seeing people respond and hearing their stories and how it's been impacted, the more pride she felt wearing it and the more power she felt wearing a Compete Everyday shirt or that message, because she knew what kind of impact it was making on people.
What was your first step when you decided, because I think we skipped over this part, or I did, Jake. You had and I love the example that you used, the analogy of the sandcastle. But it sounds like you were building a pretty nice-looking sandcastle, that you had enough people stopping by to look at it, that life was going along okay. But now you decide, as the Compete Everyday idea is starting to crystallize in your mind, there has to be a point where you decide, okay, we're going to step away from this, and we're going to take the leap and try that. How accurate is that in terms of how it happened? Or maybe I could better ask that by saying, what did that transition look like? How did you finally make the jump?
Yeah, I did not immediately burn the boats by any means. I knew selling $25 to $30 T-shirts, you got to sell a lot of T-shirts to make a living, because you also got to buy a lot of inventory. And so for me, I kept my side consulting going. I scaled it down to where I knew what I needed to get by financially. Here's pretty much my bare minimum. So that means I need to sell X amount of hours a month. So I would scale down contracts. I wouldn't renew certain contracts. I would keep smaller ones that I knew how to manage the client. I knew the workload. I knew all of that. And then every other waking hour I would spend working on Compete. And I did that for about 2 years. It was probably early January, once we started getting more wholesale accounts, that I was able to slowly slide into full-time with my Compete Everyday business and away from the consulting. And then really by summer of 2014, I was full all-in Compete Everyday from there forward.
How did some of the other pieces start to come together, like the podcast, the community, some of the speaking that you do and things like that?
Funny enough, just by, I want to say by chance, I know every success story doesn't really have that coincidence factor, but some of them fell into place. The speaking was something. I had I had two groups approach me about coming down and talking to them. And I was like, yeah, sure. What do you want? And so they're like, oh, we love your message and come talk. So I talked at a local college and I really enjoyed it. And so then another group out of Houston, Texas Children's Hospital, reached out about buying, I think it was about 75 to 100 shirts. And I was like, well, yeah, like, what do you need? And so they bought it, and it turned out that the head of HR, her son liked Compete Everyday on Twitter, and she started following it and just fell in love with the message and wanted to encourage the HR team for that year with this message, to be competitors for their patients, to be competitors for each other and their culture. And so they invited me down to Houston to come speak to them. And after that experience, I just was like, I feel like this is a better way for me to impact people than just a shirt. And so I started really looking into opportunities to speak and share that message, because for me, I very much believe that if you go to a conference, for instance, there could be 10 speakers on stage. Each one of them could be giving you the exact same message. The takeaway at every one of the 10 is the same. But because of each person's different experiences, the way they tell their stories, they're animated or they're funny, or maybe they're a little more motivational, or they could even be more somber. You're going to respond differently to them. And it could be 10 people give you that same message, but only one or two resonate with you to where you have the aha moment of what they wanted you to get. And so seeing that, I took a similar approach with our apparel. Every time I create a piece of apparel, it fits around the Compete Everyday message, and that I may throw 10 shirts at you over the course of a summer collection, and 2 of them are going to resonate with exactly what you need and the message I'm trying to convey to you, that you can be a competitor. And if I'm able to do that with shirts, but I can do it better from a stage and impact more people, that's what I care about. Because it's a different way of sharing the same message. It's like one conference speaker is me speaking on stage. One conference speaker is me having a t-shirt and you wearing the t-shirt. And another conference speaker is a podcast episode where I'm interviewing someone. It's multiple ways to tell that same message, because I know people hear it differently and accept it differently. And so if I can create those ways to reach you where you are, I have a greater opportunity to impact that trajectory you're on and hopefully pivot you in a good direction.
What's an example of something in this business that surprised you? Good or bad, but something that was just a left turn that you really didn't see coming until it was on you.
Man, how hard it is. Honestly, how hard running and growing a business is. It is fun. It is emotionally a roller coaster. But when I started, I never really ran the numbers of how many actual T-shirts I needed to sell, especially without going overseas to produce them or anything of that nature. And so that was a big surprise to me. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I still remember one of the first trade shows I did where 2 individuals came into my booth within about 5 minutes of each other. One was a probably mid-60s woman. She came in, she saw a shirt, she loved it. She asked me a number of questions about it. She's like, "Oh my gosh, I love this because da-da-da-da-da-da." Buys the shirt, leaves. 5 minutes later, a probably 17-year-old cheerleader, kind of teeny bopper style, just still in high school, comes in, looks at the same shirt, says they love it, but for the complete opposite reason. This is why I love this, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And I'm sitting there watching the 2 of these interactions take place, and I'm kind of surprised of what the one item had brought out. And I started to see things in shirts that I'd never put together before. And if you think about whenever you have an important interview or an important meeting or somebody's going on a date for a first time, we tend to have an outfit or a shirt or a tie or a dress or watch, something that is our go-to piece of clothing. It is absolutely, we wear it anytime we have something big, whether it's superstition or it makes us feel confident. It gives us a little swagger. We always attribute our swagger and our confidence to that piece of apparel, that watch, that shirt, that dress. When in all reality, we have that confidence, we have that swagger. The apparel just does a great job of reminding us of it. See, we give the credit to the apparel for making us confident, when in all reality, the apparel just reminds us of what we're capable of. And so that's been the biggest surprise to me, is that I never really intended T-shirts until my buddy recommended it. But the farther along I've gotten, the more I've seen the lines with the speaking and the T-shirts, because it's simply a way to remind people of what they're already capable of, that we too often credit to outside sources.
There's a couple of interesting things going on here related to the execution of your business, at least the T-shirt end of it, Jake, is you're talking about how difficult it is to really get a business going. You've also talked a lot about going to trade shows and getting in front of people and hearing what they have to say and learning their story and how what you're doing impacts them and vice versa. What we haven't touched on yet is the online part of it. And I'm curious what it's like to try to compete and to grow in that space while at the same time slugging it out, just being there. Because trade shows, you don't need me to tell you, that's a tough grind, isn't it? Like
it is a tough grind, and sometimes it's feast, and a lot of times it's famine.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, that part of the business is funny. So we've been e-commerce from really day one, outside of the trunk of my car. I set up a Shopify store, and we ran it through there. I never thought I would have a physical store. We looked at modifying our office and having a showroom, but the goal was always e-commerce because of the growth potential. And you weren't tied to a physical brick and mortar location. And so I would use trade shows as a marketing opportunity to get out and get in front of people. And then online, we do a heavy focus on just storytelling. We try to focus on people in the community, on what they're competing for, on positive motivation, and then supplementing that in with some ads and things on Facebook and Instagram that have made it incredibly cost effective to do. I mean, it's if done right, it's much better for me to pour $3,000 into Facebook campaigns than it is to do it on a trade show. If you look at a lot of your ROI on some of those events. But the online has kind of been the hub for us. And then we've supplemented it with the trade show sales, which if you break even at a lot of those is a great win because you hopefully have captured that customer and built a relationship, an early relationship to where they're going to come back and follow you online and check you out through social media and maybe purchase something else later. And then wholesale is a whole other animal that we haven't heavily invested into, but have a handful of good accounts that we continue to maintain and are starting to move more in the direction of focusing on how do we grow that space in a non-traditional sense, not going to the pool trade shows and the big major traditional industry trade shows, but how do we grow in the wholesale space with stores, boutiques, and retailers in a different way? Because at that point, it spreads the message farther. There's more people impacted and introduced to the Compete community. And then we can, in turn, interact and engage with them to share more content.
What are some of the things you hear from people, Jake, however that might be, in the community, via email, at a trade show, or some other kind of event? What are some of the things that you hear from people about why the Compete Everyday message and brand resonates with them?
Yeah, there's been a few. Some of the ones like the 2013 story I mentioned earlier, I actually did a blog post about kind of the best medicine sometimes is a kick in the teeth. I think that was Walt Disney who said that sometimes our best medicine is a kick in the teeth. And so I had a couple of people email me directly after that and say, I don't know if this is about you, if this was real, but I just need you to know, here's what's going on in my life, and here's how that story encouraged me. And so we get emails from individuals about people that are going through, just got diagnosed with cancer, about to go through a cancer battle. And they're buying a shirt for themselves, or a family or friend member is buying them a shirt on our site as an encouragement for what they're going through, that they can overcome it. And so getting pieces like that are really encouraging. And I mean, sometimes people just send us an email and just completely open up to us, and just kind of share their whole heart and story and everything, which is incredible to me, that they just kind of open up to a stranger. But in all reality, we've done everything we can not to be a stranger to them. And then the last one is probably one of the most encouraging things that bring a smile to my face every time is we have a guy, Errol Jacobson, out of Kansas City. And he, for the first 2 years of our Shirt of the Month program, he bought not only himself one, which he's continued to have his own Shirt of the Month club every year, but he's also bought one for a stranger. And he would say, hey, I'm buying this second one. I want you to figure out who's going to be chosen for it, who gets it, how it wants to be done. But I want somebody to be encouraged by the Compete message all year long that doesn't know about you yet. And so getting that was a huge wake-up call to me in 2013, that someone believed in what we were doing enough that they were like, hey, I want to go do this for other people. That was kind of one of the bigger surprises and pleasant notes that I got from them.
How are you different? You going back to 2011 when you started this whole thing to 7 years later now at the time that we're recording this. How does Jake Thompson view himself differently?
I would like to think I'm better at riding the roller coaster. The emotional ups and downs I feel like I've gotten better about not being as busy. I have a lot of work to do, but early on, I was doing so much and trying to do so many different things that I was more busy than I was productive. And so that I know hurt us in the early years. And I think I would say I'm smarter when I make gambles. I understand that there's people in my team that are relying on me, my family relying on me, that I'm not just a young single guy doing this by himself, that I can just take any and every chance that I have, whether it's a smart one or not. And so I feel like from a business standpoint, I'm a little more experienced and seasoned to know when I can attack and take risk and when I can't. And I think I probably just have a little bit better perspective on not letting the small stuff weigh me down, understanding that crap happens, but it's not going to completely destroy us. You just have to learn to roll with it, which I think ultimately is the majority of life.
What do you see as possible for the brand and for yourself?
I mean, my goal is truly for us to be an international lifestyle brand. And I say that we sell worldwide now. We have retailers around the world. I have customers around the world, but I want to be able to really have and work with a large number of people that are impacted and believe in this idea of competing every day. They're hungry to be better, to improve their relationships, to achieve their goals. And that would look like a multifaceted, truly lifestyle brand of speaking and events. And then you've got books and you have apparel, and all of it weaves together really well in a way that probably hasn't been done, or I haven't seen it too often outside of, say, Life is Good or Johnny Cupcakes. And those guys have incredible followings and ways that they've built their companies that I look to as beacons. But for me, it's a similar path. How many people can I impact today? How many people can I impact this year? And what is the best way to do that? And so that's really ultimately where I'm focused and trying to grow us and understand that the sales and the continued growth will take care of themselves if I maintain at least perspective on what matters and what it makes the most impact.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask about the whole, what I'll call content and storytelling side of it. I mean, even Jake, in terms of knowing what goes on the shirt, what words, what phrase, what slogan, let alone coming up with content for the podcast, for your keynotes, your workshops, the community. How does your life look like? What does a day look like for you in terms of what energy you're putting into the content and storytelling side, and what part you're putting into kind of what I'll call maybe the hard goods side?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it is seasonal, because I'll have seasons where the creative juices are just flowing, and I'll make as many notes every day as I can and fill it, and then have to go back to it later. What I try to do is I'm trying to be aware of things going on around me. I'm trying to be focused on really present where my feet are. And so the things I see in the day-to-day, and I can observe that that's a great example that I see in sports or on the news of how this fits this message. Or I hear someone say something and it sends me down a creative rabbit hole to where I have 4 to 5 t-shirt design ideas and phrases. And so from there, I'll usually take a day a week as kind of my content creation day, and I'll start writing. I'll look at our list. And so, we release 2 to 3 shirts every other month. And so each one of those shirts has a story around it, and some have a bigger story and the other 2 fall in. And what I try to do is just, how much content can I create out of that? How many pieces of example? So if you look at a single t-shirt, you may just see the t-shirt, or someone else heard the podcast episode that's about the t-shirt. You may see a YouTube video that's about the shirt, and it's never referencing directly the shirt, but the theme is all the same. And so I learned something really smart from Dan Martell a few years ago, where he takes about, I think, 3 or 4 days, and he films his entire year's worth of video. He shoots 50 videos a year. He films them all in 3 to 4 days. And what he does is, at that point, he releases 1 a week. But you get a video a week here on Monday, we'll say. On Tuesday, it's an email. Wednesday, it's a blog post. Thursday, maybe it's on Medium and LinkedIn. And on Friday, he has the audio that goes on a podcast. And so he finds a way to use that one piece of content numerous times so it gets an extended life, as well as it hits consumers and where they love to consume media the most. And so I've tried to take a page out of that and say, all right, if I'm creating these shirts, if I have messages and stories that I want to tell people of what I think is important, how can I tell them that this is important in numerous ways that one of these is going to resonate with them? They may see it on the shirt, get the shirt, immediately roll. They may hear the podcast episode or the interview and suddenly it clicks about the importance of grit. And here's why. They may watch my YouTube video and see it here, or they read the blog. I try to use that so that I'm extending the life of the content, which gives me 50 to 60 pieces of content a year I need to create, one a week, and then whittling that down into T-shirts and everything else that comes out of it. But I'm constantly reading books. I'm constantly observing everything that's going on around me. And I pull inspiration, honestly, from everywhere. It could be a conversation with a buddy at the bar. It could be an article I read on Dallas News or Facebook. And it could be a movie that I go see in the theater. That something about that movie, some scene sparked an idea in my head that I'll get up, walk out like I'm going to the bathroom, pull out my phone, take a couple of notes, and then walk back in.
It sounds to me like that's the part of things that really juices you.
It does. It absolutely does, because I think that is the piece that's the piece that comes to life in the speaking. It's the stories, it's the pieces, it's the things that fuel that when I'm trying to create a talk or work with someone, I've got 7 years worth of content. It's just finding the right piece of content. And for me, it's almost like a puzzle. You're trying to figure out what's relevant, who your audience is, where they are, and how you can take one simple message of competing every day for your life and share it in a way that this person over here is going to grasp it immediately, whereas the person in the back of the room, it's going to click with them in the closing that suddenly, aha, I can do this. I need to do this. That's what gets me going, because it's human psychology to a degree, but it's how lives are impacted and relationships are impacted and trajectories are changed.
I'm going to ask a question, then if I can ask you to hold off answering it for a second, I want to tell you why I'm asking it. And then
Let's do it.
And then I'll ask you again in case I lose you in the explanation. The question is how you came around to understanding the storytelling aspect of, I'm going to be blunt and a little bit ignorant just for the sake of making the point of selling T-shirts, of that aspect of it. And here's why I'm asking is because we both have a little bit of a marketing background, or at least this is something that I do a lot of work in. And I can't, Jake, I can't get people to see, I'm sounding a little bit, I'm generalizing recklessly here, but I find that it's really common for people to look at their outreach and think that it has to sound like an ad. And so what happens is we end up having communication and outreach and marketing and advertising that sound like ads, which is basically kind of a caricature of how human beings actually communicate. And to try to work with people to help them understand what I would call their story and what makes them uniquely them. Why do you sell Ford as opposed to Chevy? Oh, we're the number one retailer in Southwestern. No, but why? And I find that people have such a hard time getting their brains around that concept of, well, I should be putting these things out that sound like ads, and it short circuits when you're telling me that I should tell my story. What I'm hearing from you is the exact opposite of like, no, the way to really connect with our brand and to have the most impact is to not only tell the stories, but also to hear the stories of the people that we're trying to serve. How did that evolve for you as this business really started to take on a life of its own?
I mean, honestly, for me, it was kind of the focus from day one. I knew I was going into an incredibly powerful and crowded market. T-shirts, it's a low cost of entry. It's a low barrier to entry. There's a million people out there that want to have T-shirt companies. And so I had to differentiate myself from the start. And I knew the only way to do that was to build a brand. And people don't want to just be sold from a brand. They're sold from an organization, which doesn't sound nearly as warm as a brand. But a brand creates communities. It creates stories. It's where impact is. And people identify with that. And so for me, from day one, it was, how can I tell my story in a way that nobody's heard before, or that allows me to stand out among 50 other people that are lined up right beside me, printing on the exact same t-shirts, similar designs, but what makes our story more important than theirs, or more intriguing and inviting? And it was a matter of, our story is about the consumer and what they're capable of, and what our goal is to remind them that they're capable of, and putting them as Chris Brogan would say, putting them as the hero of the story is what I went to. And so, I mean, I would blog articles that I would see in the newspaper. I'd write short summaries and link to them of famous athletes to people you've never heard of doing things that fit the Compete Everyday message. So you would see it in multiple ways, multiple perspectives, and the impact. And so that's always kind of been there, because there's been nothing very different about us other than my approach has always been to tell the story, because the impact is made in the story, and the story is power. It's like with me as a speaker, I'm in the motivational space, and I struggled my first couple of years in that space of moving forward and running with things, because if you think traditional motivational speaker, it's one of two results. You're either thinking of Chris Farley living in a van down by the river, or it's someone that has gone through a traumatic experience. They were homeless. They overcame a drug addiction. They this, and this. I have none of those. And it was pointed out to me by a very wise friend that you're right. You have none of those pieces. You don't have any of those advantages that they do in terms of being a motivational speaker. But here's the kicker. 90% of your audience doesn't either. And when you suddenly start to realize that you can relate directly with them because you feel, quote, normal, but you've taken a very abnormal approach to mindset and competing and being a competitor, so that's relatable. Because it's not I'll never understand what it's like to be the only survivor of X, Y, and Z, but I can relate to being stuck doing work that wasn't fulfilling and driving home and opening beers and drinking a few because I wanted to feel a little bit numb because I just wasn't happy with what I was doing with my life. And things like that you can relate to. And it's all around story and being honest and real and authentic with your story, because that's where power is found. That's why stories have been one of the most powerful things in humanity and passed down for so many generations, because there's so many lessons and connections that are created within story.
I hope that anybody that's still listening to this, Jake, that has any kind of business at all, paid very close attention to what you said about brand and about storytelling, and I would encourage you to just go and rewind and listen to it again, because I think that you just absolutely nailed it. But I'm sure you see it every day, the trap that others fall into of, well, I've got this thing now, a T-shirt and an idea, so now I got to figure out how to market it, versus allowing it to connect through the story. I find that really intriguing that you inherently understood that right from the word go. I will geek out on all of this stuff related to story. Like I will. And I had a conversation with my printer the other day, who I've worked with for 6 years, talking about marketing and how's sales and marketing going. And they have a really cool system with how they do marketing, but he's driven because he sees the impact that like a company like us can make on the consumers. And he's like, I love it because I see your end result. And our team isn't able to see that always. We're not able to see the shirts we send off that are then resold, that how that customer reacts. And so we're able to with you and a few others. And I looked at him, I was like, well, I said, your story is what you need to be selling. I said, you need to go get 2 to 3 of my customers. You need to go get customer from each of your other vendors.
And you need to ask them why they love wearing that shirt. And you need to tell, and they need to talk about, I love this shirt because it not only is it comfortable, but I mean, this message right here reminds me that I am capable of so much more, or this, or this. And I said, Matt, you throw this stuff on a video, you share that story, and then you flash back and say, we do what we do so that you can impact the people the way these people are. That's a story. And it's a t-shirt printer. You would never think anything that's just a traditional behind the scenes t-shirt printer, but there's stories within stories. And so every company has them. Every company has reasons that they're founded and created and named the things they are and where the history lies. And so finding that and using that is your biggest competitive advantage, because there is no other you out there.
Jake, I really appreciate you taking the time to share all this with me. What you've done, I admire your vision for where you're going, and I hope I can be a helpful and supportive friend in some fashion as the journey continues to develop. And I want to congratulate you on your perseverance and the successes that you've enjoyed, and wish you all the best going forward. Thanks so much for this time.
No, thank you for having me. This was an absolute pleasure, and I was honored to be a part of the show.
To connect with Jake Thompson, visit him on one of his websites. You can find him at competeeveryday.com. And you can also find information a little bit more about Jake specifically at lifeisworthcompetingfor.com. You can also find Jake on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I will have the links for all of those up on the show notes blog post for this episode, which is number 79. And you can find that at noschedulemanpodcast.com. If you like this episode, you're probably going to like episode 73 with Matthew Kimberly, an internationally known sales trainer and speaker. That episode is called Fun, Freedom, and Flow, and listening to Jake tell his story about how he tried on a few different hats and ultimately found they weren't for him and knew that he needed to go out on his own and live his story his way immediately made me think of Matthew. I think you'll really enjoy that. It's number 73. I also encourage you to listen to The Road to Becoming a NASCAR Champion with my friend Cole Perrin, who is the crew chief, at least at this time, for the reigning NASCAR Monster Energy Cup champion, Martin Truex Jr. Cole is from a little town near where I'm from in Ontario, Canada, and shared an incredible story of his journey from going from that small town in Ontario, Canada, to ultimately finding his way to the very top of the top NASCAR series. It's called The Road to Becoming a NASCAR Champion. I think it was originally episode 34. I re-released it as a special edition, so anyway, I'll link to it. You'll find it on iTunes or wherever you find this podcast, but I'll link to it with this show notes blog post at noschedulemanpodcast.com. Look for it with Cole Perrin. And episode 55, along the lines of story that Jake Thompson was talking about, Michelle Nuret, who is a speaker, an author, and the founder of a terrific series of events called Mo Mondays here in Canada, he did a podcast with me, and the episode is called Sharing More of Our Stories and Ourselves. And Michelle really shared some profound insights about himself and how he felt that he needed to get more of himself and his story out into the world. And maybe even more important to note is why he felt that way, related to his mom and to his dad, and the very different viewpoints they had on what they shared about their own journeys. Really powerful stuff in episode 55 with Michelle Nuret. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention episode 67 with Dan Martell, because Jake Thompson mentioned Dan. That's called How Do I Create a Life I Love? And I highly recommend that episode 67. You can find those and all past episodes of this podcast anywhere around the world, on iTunes, on Stitcher, at YouTube, various other outlets, and at noschedulemanpodcast.com. If you'd like to connect with me, that'd be awesome. Just look for No Schedule Man on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter, or visit me at kevinbolmer.com and jump onto one of my email lists if you like. They're right on the front page. If you do that, you'll get periodic emails from me to support you on your journey of personal and professional growth. Keep in mind, you can also be a part of my online mastermind and mentorship community. It's called the Turtle Tribe. It's ideally suited for people looking to embrace the process of personal and professional growth so that they can do their best work, live their best life, and enjoy each step along the way. If you'd like to learn more about that and maybe start a free trial membership, just visit theturtletribe.com. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it's been helpful. If so, please subscribe wherever you might be listening. It would be great to have you here again for the next chapter of Journeys with the No Schedule Man.
Just a little deja vu.